One of the first cultures that we're going to investigate are the Native American cultures, and we're going to find out what kind of foods they're eating today as compared to historically what type of foods that they were eating and what that has done to their health over the shift of hundreds of years. At one point, everyone living in America was Native American, and that has dropped to only 5.4 million people of Native American descent currently living in the United States, and that only makes up about 2% of the population. Most of the population is living in California, Arizona, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. In Illinois, we only have 0.3% of the population being Native Americans. So there is clearly a decrease in the number of population. Most importantly, this is a great case study to investigate and see how their lifestyle has changed from hundreds of years ago to now, and what that has done to their health. As we're studying the Native American culture and the great contrast between what they used to eat and what they're currently eating, we have to also realize that they've had a shift in lifestyle. Their food, their activity, and their opportunities in the Americas have changed, and that's impacted their health. What we need to remember as we're going through this is the Native Americans were forced to change their food activity level and opportunities, but are we as Americans of various cultures right now living in America doing some of the same things on purpose that the Native Americans were forced to do? So our lifestyle has changed over the years as well as the Native Americans, but the Native Americans were pretty much forced to change, and that has dramatically impacted their health. Let's first look at what their lives used to be like quickly, and then we'll see what happened to change that. But Native Americans lived near waters. They were transient, so they could have moved their homes and moved their property very quickly. They lived not only near the bodies of water and rivers, lakes, but they also were able to gather foods and plant their own foods right with them, regardless of where they were at. This image just shows some of the gardening. They would gather seeds and they would plant the seeds near their homes so that they can have various crops to eat. They relied heavily on growing their own crops. Three of the most famous crops that they grew were corn, squash, and beans, and it's called the Three Sisters. It's a very unique opportunity in which the Native Americans maximized the use of land. They would first plant corn, and when the corn sprouted to about 2 inches, then they would plant pole beans. And the actual beans, the plant of it, would grow and support itself with the corn stalk. And when the beans would grow high enough, they would then plant squash, and the squash is a very low-lying plant with huge leaves, and that would kind of cover the ground and stop any of the weeds from growing. So the Native Americans were able to grow 3 crops in one small area, and this is kind of an image of how, an animation of how they would do that and what it would look like. Again, it's called the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. Here's a couple pictures of how they would gather foods. They would walk through the forest gathering nuts, gathering berries. In the lakes, they would actually dredge the bottom of the lakes to pull up some wild rice. But they were very good at getting their food from nature, and also, in addition to planting their own seeds, they went out and found food from the forests that they lived near. Males in the Native American culture would hunt, and one of the most important animals that they would hunt was the buffalo, and they would use all parts of the buffalo. They would waste nothing from it. They would eat the meat. They would use the skin and the fur for making teepees and making clothing. They would use the bones to make utensils and weapons. They were avid hunters, and they only took what they needed, but they would hunt all kinds of wild animals, and they pretty much ethically controlled how much they took and how much they let survive in the wild, so that the population of animals would support their family and their tribes for sustained periods of time. But remember, the buffalo is one of the most important things that they hunted in North America. Native Americans would also supply a lot of their food from fishing, and they fished not only in the summer and fall, but one of the main times they would fish would be in the winter when they would ice fish. Whatever they would catch, whether they were using spears or nets, they would dry out, and they could utilize that fish for long periods of time when they couldn't hunt. So they could support themselves solely on nature, whether they were fishing, hunting, gathering, or growing their own foods. Let's talk a little bit about what the traditional foods are in the Native American cultures. And while we're doing that, think to yourself, are the Native Americans or ourselves, are we eating those type of foods in today's society? 3 foods that are native to America that were found here growing wild were cranberries, grapes, and blueberries. Here are some of the foods that were so important in the Native American culture. Remember, we talked about the 3 sisters, but they also had eaten lots of wild onions, cabbage, cactus, beans, and mushrooms, all different kinds of squash. They would gather berries wild, and they would plant some of the seeds that they found with corn, pumpkin, and different squashes. Here's a list of some of the meats that they would consume. They would hunt these foods, and then they would preserve them so that they would last for long periods of time. So take a look at the list and see, are we eating those kind of foods today? If you have a little bit of time, you can also copy and paste these URLs into your browser to see what a Native American fish trap would look like, or also an image of how they would hunt buffalo on YouTube. Native Americans were very big with gathering or growing their own herbs, and they would use this as their medicines. They didn't have prescription drugs back then, but they still survived, and they would use herbs and different type of plants, and they would put the leaves of these in teas and waters and drink them, and that was their kind of medicine, not only to treat problems, but also to prevent them. I just wanted to give you a quick look at what the Native American food pyramid might look like, and you see lots of whole grains on the bottom, where they would also grow and gather their vegetables and fruit. They would eat natural protein from animals that they hunted, and they used fats, oils very sparingly, if at any. I mean, they didn't have any type of processed food whatsoever in the Native American cultures years ago. Everything was natural and whole. Just a quick list for you to look over about the traditional foods in the Native American culture. And again, compare that to some of the things that you're eating today, and soon we'll see what the Native Americans in today's society are eating. This is a great case study to look back at and say, a group of people who used to eat these type of foods, who are no longer eating that, but are eating different type of foods, what happened to their health when they switched over? Native Americans were very active, and they burned lots of calories in a day, besides hunting, the farming work, the gathering work that they had to do. Even in the evenings, they would dance and they would play games, and they were always moving. At times, they had to walk very long distances to either hunt the herds they were seeking or gather the berries they were seeking, and they did a lot of physical labor. They were always on the move. It's kind of a summary of what their traditional ways of Native American lifestyle was. They were mainly hunters and gatherers, and that took a lot of energy. They had to walk miles and carry heavy loads while they were doing this. So they would walk all the time. They were very active. They had a feast or famine cycle, so there were long periods of time where maybe they didn't get anything when they were hunting, so they didn't have a lot to eat. And then when they did get, say, a buffalo, they would have abundance of food to eat from that animal. They farmed their own food, but again, it was all whole foods, and it was virtually salt-free, virtually sugar-free. Only natural sugars from plants were they able to obtain. No processed food. Everything was natural. Fast forward from ancient times to today's society, and the Native American food choices have changed dramatically. Their portion sizes are very large. Their fat has increased dramatically in their diet. They're very low in fiber now. They're not eating a lot of the traditional vegetables and fruits. They're not eating natural meats. A large percentage of the people are obtaining their food in the Native American culture from commodity food programs or supplemental food programs, such as food stamps, or may refer to them as SNAP, but a very large portion are obtaining their food from these commodity food programs, and it's a lot of processed food contrasted to the natural foods that they used to consume in their ancient cultures. And here's a list of their current food choices in today's society. As you can see, lots of it is processed, canned, white flour type products. We see void of vegetables and fruits and whole grains on this list, and we have to ask ourselves, what happened to make this drastic change from natural wild foods to what they're consuming now? And are we the rest of the Americans living in this land eating those type of foods on purpose as well. Native American cultures have changed from a very active hunting-gathering type of lifestyle to now being mostly sedentary. They're not moving very often. They're sitting around a lot, and their physical activity has diminished greatly compared to ancient cultures. So we have this dramatic difference to how Native American cultures used to eat anciently compared to how they're eating today, and we have to ask ourselves, why did this happen, and what impact did that cause on their health? Two main things that may have contributed to the change in their diets were the loss of the buffalo availability, and they could no longer grow the crops that they were used to growing right near their home. So we have to think, why did these two things happen? Why did the buffalo disappear, and why could they no longer grow those crops, and how did that impact their food choices? In the beginning of the 1800s, there was 40 million buffalo roaming wild in the United States. By 1895, only 400 buffalo remained, and they're virtually extinct in the wild right now in Americas. We have to say, what happened to the buffalo? Well, when the Europeans came over, they started to hunt and poach the buffalo for a couple of different reasons. One theory is that they did it just for fun, to kill, and they weren't even using the buffalo for meat or any of its byproducts to make anything. They were just killing them, whether they were hunting on land or trains, but just killing them for fun and letting their carcasses lay in the field and deteriorate. Another theory is that the Europeans wanted to come over and take over the land and eliminate the Native Americans, and they thought the way to eradicate the Native American people were to kill its food source, which was the buffalo. And so there's a couple of theories about why the buffalo disappeared, but it was basically done maybe in spite of the Native American cultures to try to get rid of them. And the main reason that the Native Americans were not able to grow their own crops any longer were water dams. In the late 1900s, I should say in the early 1900s, the U.S. government decided to dam various sources of water that used to flow naturally to the Native Americans, specifically in the Southwest. And when they dammed those waters, they were able to build cities such as Las Vegas, Phoenix, and so forth in the Southwest. And then those cities got all the water that was diverted, and the Native Americans were left without a water supply. And therefore, without water, they were unable to grow their crops any longer. They were not able to grow the Three Sisters or the food that they needed to sustain their people. I need you now at this point in time to copy one of these YouTubes into a browser, or all three if you have time, and view the video about the change in lifestyle for the Native Americans. And basically what happened after the buffalo disappeared and the water was dammed. These people were starving. They were starving to death because they had no food to eat. The U.S. government felt bad that they were starving to death and that they had no food to eat. So they started to supply them with boxed food through commodity projects. The Native Americans would go to these warehouses and pick up boxed food. And the boxed food was not nutritious whatsoever. It was not whole and natural, but basically it was canned vegetables. It was boxed macaroni and cheese. It was processed grains because that lasts longer. So the government would get this processed and cheap food, and they would give it to the Native American cultures for free because they felt bad that their food supply was taken away from them. The Native American cultures started eating this type of food, the macaroni and cheese and the soups and the canned and boxed and packaged foods. And very quickly, they went from absolutely no incidence of diabetes in their community. They had 0 reports of diabetes. After obtaining this food and eating it, there was a dramatic rise in diabetes, almost to the point that right now, 50% of the Native American population who are eating these boxed and processed foods have either pre-diabetes or have diabetes. It's the #1 culture in the United States for incidence of diabetes right now. And we have to think that the main reason that they've gotten this disease was a switch from whole natural foods when they would hunt, gather, grow, and fish to now eating only packaged and processed grains loaded with sugar, loaded with salt, and it has caused a dramatic increase in diabetes to the point that they're the #1 cultural population with the incidence of diabetes in the U.S. today. The Native Americans went from virtually no chronic disease in their ancient cultures. Sure, they had a short life expectancy because they were dying of accidents and pathogens such as viruses and bacteria. However, they had clearly no incidence of chronic disease. When they switched their lifestyle into eating processed foods and limiting their activities, they were no longer hunting, they were no longer planting and gathering. When they started sitting around and eating this processed food, all of these chronic diseases arose. And you can see on the screen here, they've had heart disease and cancers, just like we're experiencing in our society today, various cultural groups. But this is a perfect case study to see that a change in lifestyle from eating healthy and being active to a change where you're not moving around and you're eating processed food, what will this do to you? There's a very high incidence of diabetes in Native American cultures, whereas hundreds of years ago there was absolutely 0 cases of this until they started eating that commodity processed foods. We have the knowledge now to know what happened in the Native American cultures. Their lifestyle has changed in activity and food consumption, and they got sick. Now, many Native American leaders are trying to take steps to eradicate that. And they're trying to teach the youth and the villagers now who live on the Native American refugee tribes where they live. They're trying to teach them how to plant the vegetables again, how to grow wild grains, how to cultivate and gather, and hunt their own foods. Because when we switched that away, and that was taken away from them, they were not able to supply themselves with their own foods, and they were eating this processed food, and they got sick. Plus, that led to lots of cases of mental illness and depression in which they were not able to feed themselves. Their culture was essentially stripped from them, and they became very sad about the fact that all of this had been done to them, that their buffalo was gone, that they couldn't grow their own crops. Well, like I said, leaders have taken steps to bring more of the ancient culture back into their society, so they're learning about what they used to do, and they're trying to do that again. So you could copy some of these links to see what's being done to help the Native Americans right now. And at this time, I want you to take a moment to think, are various cultures in the United States purposely eating the processed foods, eating the processed grains and sugars and salts, when we have the option to eat whole and natural, but we're maybe choosing the easier route out to eat these processed foods? And could that potentially be causing us to have the epidemic of chronic heart disease, cancers, and diabetes in our society today if we at the individual or family level started to take more steps to eat the whole grains and vegetables and fruits and natural foods again? Would we have a better chance at preventing chronic disease in our family and throughout society?